The locksmith's drill runs for 11 minutes. It is a weekday morning, 3 months after the funeral, and the gun safe stands in a hallway between the bathroom and the linen closet. A green steel box the size of a refrigerator that nobody in the family has the combination to. The daughter waits in the kitchen while the carbide bit chews through the lockwork and gray dust settles into the carpet. Then the handle turns, the door swings, and the smell comes out first. Gun oil and old felt, air that has been sealed since before she was born. Inside, upright in the felt, stands a rifle with a folding bayonet under the barrel and Chinese characters stamped into the receiver, and taped to the stock is a yellowed federal form, filled out in the old man's own handwriting, kept for 58 years and explained to no one. That rifle is number 4 on this list. It is a Chinese Type 56, the Chinese-built AK-47, carried out of Vietnam by a Marine and registered under the one-time federal amnesty of 1968, and one has sold for $56,000. The scene in that hallway is repeating, in one form or another, in houses all over the country. American servicemen brought home the arms of their enemies from every war since 1898, said almost nothing, and left an inventory nobody wrote down. Now the markings, the paperwork, and above all the federal registration decide whether the thing in the closet is worth $400 or $400,000. The rule was always the same. A rifle or a pistol could come home in a bag. Anything that fired more than once per trigger pull came home into a legal system, and that difference is why the second half of this list climbs so steeply. At the very top sits a gold-washed Walther PP that a United States Army lieutenant took from Hitler's empty Munich apartment on the 29th of April, 1945. The last time it sold publicly in 1987, it brought $114,000. Then the highest price ever paid for a piece of military memorabilia. The felt in the safe holds 1 gun. The country holds 25. The count begins where the market begins, at the bottom, with the gun most likely to be standing in an American closet at this hour. Number 25, the Mosin Nagant M91/30. The long Russian bolt action of 2 world wars, a 7.62 millimeter rifle with a straight bolt handle and a socket bayonet, built in the tens of millions and handed to every army the Soviet Union ever armed. Americans took them off Chinese and North Korean troops in Korea and off the enemy again in Vietnam, and carried them home to families who looked at the plain wood and the dead weight and concluded the old man had bought surplus junk from a catalog. The rifle did not argue. It stood in a closet behind the winter coats for 50 years, the cosmoline still gummed in the bolt, and nobody ever asked why the writing on the receiver was Cyrillic. Nobody asked where it had been. Nobody asked why he kept it. A refurbished Mosin brings $250 to $600 in 2026, and the spread stays narrow because the supply is enormous. The only example that climbs meaningfully past the top of it is an unrefurbished wartime rifle with a capture story that can be pinned down, and in most houses that story died with the man who knew it. The next rifle came out of the same wars, made shorter and meaner. Number 24, the Chinese Type 53 carbine. A Chinese-built copy of the Soviet carbine M44. Short, brutal, with a folding spike bayonet permanently attached to the side of the barrel and a muzzle flash that the men who fired it never forgot. It came home from Korea and from the early years of Vietnam, and for most of the soldiers who took one, it was the first Chinese-marked weapon they had ever handled. Proof, stamped into the receiver, that the enemy across the wire was not the enemy the newspapers named. Those stamps are what a collector reads first now, the factory codes and the dates, because they establish where the carbine was born. The second thing he establishes is how it entered the country. A rifle that came home in a duffel bag from Korea and a rifle that passed through a post-war importer's warehouse are the same machine and 2 different objects. $650 is the top of this one's market, and it belongs to the clean, unimported bringbacks. $300 is the floor, And the A whole distance between the two numbers is nothing more than the route the gun took home. France built the one above it. Number 23, the French MAS-36. The last bolt-action rifle France ever adopted. A stubby 7.5mm military arm with an oddly bent bolt handle, a spike bayonet stored backward in a tube in the forend, and no safety catch at all. Not a hidden one, not a broken one. None, by design. Americans picked them up across liberated France and later out of Indochina, and a fair number were never captured in any sense of the word. They were traded off French soldiers for cigarettes, a distinction that rarely survived into the family story. To Americanize the bent bolt and the missing safety made the thing look homemade, and for decades estate sales wrote it off accordingly, listed as a foreign hunting rifle of no particular kind and priced to move. Carried at last to somebody who can read it, the odd little rifle turns out to be worth $400 to $900. More for wartime Saint-Étienne production, with the bayonet still in the forend. And whatever the cigarettes cost, the trade has aged well. The oldest rifle in this stretch of the list came home a war earlier. Number 22, the Mannlicher M95. The straight pull rifle of Austria-Hungary, worked by shoving the bolt forward and back without ever turning it, fed by an en-bloc clip that dropped out of the bottom of the magazine the moment the last round was chambered. Doughboys carried them home from the Italian front and from the occupation duty of 1918 and 1919, and a second wave came back a generation later, when the same rifles turned up in German hands in the next war. Families kept them for the action. The straight pull was a curiosity, the kind of mechanism a grandfather would demonstrate exactly once at a Thanksgiving. The bolt hissing forward and back, the empty clip clattering onto the table. And never explain. The market splits the survivors cleanly in two. Post-war shortened carbines flooded out of Europe by the crate, and they hold the bottom. An original long rifle, never cut down, is the one worth having. The M95 runs $400 to $1,000, and the upper half of that range belongs entirely to the rifles nobody got around to shortening. And then there are the pistols. Number 21, the Chinese Type 54 pistol. The Chinese-built copy of the Soviet Tokarev, a 7.62mm automatic with no safety worth the name, carried by North Vietnamese officers and taken off them by American troops through the whole length of that war. The pistol was the trophy an infantryman could actually keep. A rifle was a hard thing to move through a chaotic rotation home. A pistol rode in the pocket of a rucksack. And thousands of Type 54s crossed the Pacific exactly that way. What decides their value now is the same thing every time, and it is paper. The soldier who kept his registration form owns one kind of object, and the soldier who did not owns another. Same steel, same caliber, same war, two different things on the appraiser's table. The spread is $500 to $1,000, and the ceiling rises a little every year because the veterans who filled out those forms are dying, and each form that goes unexplained into a drawer thins the count of the ones that can still be proven. Papered, it is a $1,000 gun. Most of them are not papered. Number 20, the MAB Model D. France built it in the 1930s as a pocket automatic, well-made and unremarkable, the kind of pistol a bank manager might carry and nobody would remember. And then the German army arrived. The occupation did not close the factory, it took the factory, and the pistols kept coming off the line exactly as before, except that each one now passed under a German inspector's punch on its way into a German officer's holster. That is the whole story a collector reads in the metal. German acceptance stamps on a French pistol, the contradiction of an occupied country pressed into the steel itself. Americans picked them up at Normandy and on the drive east, and the Model D came home in a coat pocket, undeclared and unexplained. It disappeared into a bedside drawer for the next 50 years, and when the drawer finally came open, The family saw a small European target pistol, because that is what it looks like when nobody tells you otherwise. Condition does not draw the line here, and neither does caliber. The stamp does. A plain commercial Model D is worth a few $100s. The same pistol wearing German acceptance marks brings $600 to $1,200. The bedside drawer held one kind of trophy. The dresser box under the war medals held another, and this one could hurt somebody. Number 19. The Glicenti Model 1910. Italy's service automatic of the First World War was a 9mm pistol built on a frame so lightly made that firing full-power ammunition through it can wreck the gun, which places it among the genuinely dangerous antiques on this list. An object that looks like every other old military pistol and behaves like none of them. The left side plate lifts off the frame entirely, an arrangement no other service pistol shares, and on a collector's table that single feature identifies it from across the room. Doughboys carried them back from the Italian front after the armistice, and a generation later a second wave came home from the Mediterranean campaign, taken from Italian holsters where the same pistol was, improbably, still serving. 2 wars, 1 gun, 1 design that had been fragile the day it was adopted. The families who inherited them rarely fired them, and that neglect is likely why so many survive intact. A Glicenti now sells between $700 and $1,300, and an example that kept its original holster and matching magazine does considerably better. Number 18. The Japanese Type 44 Cavalry Carbine. This was the short Arisaka built for horse cavalry, and its signature was a folding spike bayonet hinged under the muzzle, a blade that swung out and locked with a flick of the hand. One of the most elegant solutions any army ever found to the problem of a mounted man and a bayonet. Marines and soldiers took them across the Pacific from rear area troops and cavalry units, and in a surrender pile of ordinary rifles, the Type 44 was the carbine everybody wanted precisely because of that blade. The trouble, 80 years later, is what the decades removed. The folding bayonet is almost always gone, the nose cap with it, and the matching bolt went wherever the decades sent it, and on the receiver sits the deciding mark, the 16-petal Imperial Chrysanthemum, ground off on rifles that were formally surrendered and left intact on rifles that were captured. The flower itself testifies to how the gun changed hands. What a collector is paying for is not the carbine, but the completeness. The mum uncut, the bolt numbers agreeing, the bayonet still folding on its hinge. And that is the spread between $500 and $1,500, a distance the complete examples have entirely to themselves. Number 17. The Liebel Model 1886. In 1886, this was the most dangerous rifle on Earth, the first military arm to fire smokeless powder, and its arrival made every other rifle obsolete overnight. Obsolete in Berlin, obsolete in Vienna, obsolete in Springfield. By the time American doughboys handled it, its tube magazine running under the barrel had itself been out of date for 30 years, a revolution grown old in service. The American Expeditionary Force fought part of its war with French arms, and labels and Berthier came home from French depots. Traded, issued, or simply carried out of the trenches at the armistice, the distinctions dissolving somewhere on the Atlantic. Then came the long silence. One went up into the rafters of a barn in 1919 and stayed there for a century. The stock darkening year by year, the tube magazine still holding a cartridge, nobody noticed. The family that finally pulled it down saw exactly what it appeared to be. A long, heavy, foreign old gun, barn junk, with a bayonet lug, worth whatever the scrap man offered. It is worth $600 to $1,400, and the early, unaltered rifles with their original finish intact sit at the top of that range. The Revolution of 1886, priced at last. Number 16, the Soviet SVT-40. This was the Red Army's semi-automatic battle rifle, gas-operated 7.62 millimeters, feeding from a detachable magazine, and it was in the field before any American infantryman had ever faced a self-loading enemy rifle. The Germans who captured them did not throw them away. They prized the SVT enough to issue it formally to their own troops. Americans took them off German soldiers in Europe as often as off communist ones in Korea, and the capture story handed down in a family almost never matches the flag on the rifle. A grandfather who said he took it from a German was probably telling the truth, and so was the one who said he took it in Korea. The market, meanwhile, turns hard on a single question: what happened to the rifle after the war? Soviet arsenals refurbished most survivors and stripped the originality out of them in the process, so that an untouched wartime rifle, the dirt of its own war still in the grain, is now a genuinely scarce object. The refurbished rifles bring $400 to $650. A Finnish capture example brings a little more. An unrefurbished original starts where the others stop, at $650, and climbs past $1,500. The rifle below it was taken from an enemy no living American remembers fighting. Number 15, the Spanish Mauser model, 1893. On the heights above Santiago in 1898, Spanish regulars outnumbered 10 to 1 worked the bolts of a smokeless 7mm rifle with a flush box magazine and made the Americans on the slope below pay for every yard of it. The United States Army had come to Cuba carrying the Krag, and the men doing the climbing understood, before the War Department did, that the Krag was the wrong weapon. Congress was still arguing about the lesson years afterward, and it was this rifle that pushed the Army toward the Springfield that replaced it. Volunteers and regulars carried Model 1893s off the field in Cuba, and again in the Philippines, and those rifles came home 2 full generations before the World Wars. The family that owns one now is usually 4 or 5 generations removed from the man who took it. No letter survives. No name survives. No story survives at all. The rifle stands in a closet as an anonymous old Mauser, its provenance dissolved by nothing more dramatic than time. Around $800 buys an ordinary Model 1893 in 2026, a rifle that can be tied to the Santiago campaign by its markings, and its unaltered configuration reaches $2,500 and keeps going. The next entry could not have come home that way at all. Number 14, the Soviet DP-28. The Degtyaryov light machine gun is recognizable at any distance by its pan magazine, a flat steel disc lying on top of the receiver like a dinner plate, and it was the automatic weapon of the Eastern Front and, later, of every communist army in Asia. Americans took them in Korea and took them again in Vietnam. But the Degtyaryov could not ride home at the bottom of a barracks bag the way a Mauser could, not lawfully, not in any year of either war. So almost every DP-28 that reached the United States came back dead, cut through the receiver, welded or torched, disabled beyond argument. It was not a weapon anymore. It was a shape. For decades it hung on a garage wall above the workbench, the pan magazine doing duty as an ashtray, a machine gun in a suburban garage that nobody thought twice about. And that distinction, dead steel or registered steel, is where the money divides. A deactivated DP-28 brings roughly $2,500 to $5,000, while a live registered example belongs to a different world entirely. One that virtually never surfaces from a family estate because the paperwork that would make it legal almost never exists. Number 13. The Krieghoff Luger. Heinrich Krieghoff of Suhl built roughly 13,800 Luger pistols for the Luftwaffe beginning in 1935, a fraction of total Luger production, a contract gun made for the Air Force while the famous makers supplied everyone else. Every one of them carries the Krieghoff anchor trademark stamped into the toggle. Air Force officers wore them, and so they came home with airmen, and with the ground troops who overran German airfields in the last year of the war, folded into the ordinary tide of souvenir pistols. A family looking at one sees only a Luger. They never read the small anchor on the toggle, and the anchor is the entire difference. Collectors treat the Krieghoff as one of the small handful of pistols a serious German collection must contain, and the gap between it and an ordinary wartime Luger sits wholly inside that one stamp. Sound examples fetch $2,600 to $5,000. Early Luftwaffe-approved guns, and complete rigs the strongest of them, and the premium traces back all of it to an anchor smaller than a fingernail. Keep that anchor in mind. It comes back near the top of this list. Number 12, the Japanese Type II paratrooper rifle. This was a rifle built to come apart. The Japanese answer to the problem of dropping an infantryman out of an airplane with a full-length Arisaka, split at the receiver and rejoined by a heavy interrupted thread wedge that a man could tighten by hand. Japanese airborne units were small and used rarely, so the rifle was made in the low thousands, and the ones Americans captured came from a handful of islands and from home island depots after the surrender. It came home wrapped like any other Arisaka and went into the attic like any other Arisaka, and there it waited for a family that would not know what it was. Then it comes apart in their hands. A daughter or a grandson lifts it, the halves separate at the receiver, and the natural conclusion is that the old rifle is broken. More than one Type II has been sold at an estate sale for the price of a common Arisaka by a family disposing of what they took for damaged goods. A genuine Type II sells for $2,500 to $6,000. A complete example, with matching halves and an intact chrysanthemum on the receiver, runs higher still. Number 11, the VG-1 Volkssturm rifle. This is the rifle of the end. A crude bolt action built in the last winter of the war for the Volkssturm. The militia of old men and boys called up to hold a country that was already gone. It was assembled from stamped and rough-machined parts around the magazine of a captured foreign rifle, and almost nothing about it is finished. The wood is unshaped, the metal wears no bluing worth the name, and the whole object reads as a document of a state that had run out of everything but steel and orders. Americans overran the depots holding them in the last weeks of the war and carried them home as curiosities, and the ones that survived did so for the plainest reason on this list. Nobody thought them worth shooting. The rifle was worth almost nothing to the country that made it, a last-hour improvisation pressed into the hands of men too old and boys too young, and that worthlessness is now the entire value. A VG-1 brings $10,500 to $12,500 on rarity and on what it represents, because quality of manufacture never entered into it. The last winter. The old men, the boys. Number 10, the Mauser 1918 T-Gewehr. From this point down, the list leaves behind anything that could come home folded in a barracks bag. The T-Gewehr is the first anti-tank rifle ever built, a 13mm bolt action nearly 6 feet long and close to 40 pounds, made in the last year of the First World War to punch through the armor of British tanks. It has no buffer, no muzzle brake, no mechanism of any kind to soften a recoil that broke collarbones. Doughboys shipped a handful home in 1919 as regimental trophies and battlefield souvenirs, and over the decades a few of those walked quietly out of the armories and the American Legion halls and into private hands. It is too large to hide and too strange to explain, and so the survivors turn up in attics and barns rather than gun cabinets. An object that size does not get displayed. It gets leaned in a corner, covered with whatever is at hand, and left there for a lifetime. 6 feet of steel that nobody in the house can name. It runs $8,000 to $15,000, and the examples that kept the original bipod account for the upper end. The T-Geber at least resembles a rifle. Number 9, the Solothurn S18-1000 resembles artillery. Developed in Switzerland and built for the German and Italian armies, it is a 20mm semi-automatic anti-tank rifle, more than 8 feet long, riding on a bipod at the front and a monopod at the rear, firing a cannon shell from a magazine mounted on the side of the receiver. And because that bore exceeds 1/2 inch, American law declines to consider it a rifle at all. It is a destructive device, which means it lives on a federal registry and moves from one owner to the next, only with a stamp and the government's approval. The ones in this country did not come home in anyone's baggage. They came back through official channels, ordnance evaluation, and museum consignment, and then filtered into private collections over the decades that followed, each transfer recorded, each owner approved. A family that inherits one inherits a federal paperwork problem along with the steel, and the paperwork does not care that the owner is dead. At auction, a registered example has carried an estimate of $8,000 to $12,000, and a complete matched rig, with its crates and magazines and accessories, climbs toward $20,000, and then the size stops mattering. Number 8, the MP3008 is a weapon a man could hide under a coat, and its value has almost nothing to do with the steel. This is the German Sten. In the final months of the war, with the factories bombed and the time gone, Germany copied the crude British submachine gun it had spent 5 years mocking, stripped it further still, and pushed it out to the Volkssturm. Perhaps 10,000 were finished before the end. The magazine housing turned to point down instead of sideways. The welds left rough, the whole gun costing a few hours of labor. Almost the entire surviving stock went to Czechoslovakia after the war, and few reached the United States early enough to be registered. The handful of transferable examples, the ones on the Federal Registry, the only ones that can legally change hands at all, are a genuine rarity. Condition barely enters the appraisal because nobody is paying for workmanship the factory never supplied. A gun that cost a collapsing country a few hours of labor, welded by men who knew the war was already lost, now sells registered for $15,000 to $25,000. The welds are still rough. Number 7, the Bergmann MP18 is where that legal accident has its origin. It was the first submachine gun to see real combat issued to German storm troops in 1918. A 9mm weapon with a snail drum magazine sticking out the left side, built to clear a trench in a way no rifle could. The Versailles Treaty named it specifically and tried to abolish it, a fair measure of how badly it frightened the men on the receiving end. Doughboys brought a small number home in 1919, decades before federal machine gun law existed, and that timing is the only reason any MP18 can be legally owned in America today. Not the gun, the calendar. The men who carried them up the gangplank were not exploiting a loophole. There was no law yet to have a loophole in, and the guns entered the country the way a clock or a helmet did. A transferable MP18 brings $17,000 to $25,000 with the originality of the receiver and the presence of the correct drum driving the number. And the registration paper that later attached to it is worth more than every piece of steel the Bergmann factory cut. The paper carries the price, the gun carries the paper. Number 6, the Japanese Type 100 submachine gun is where the arithmetic turns cold. It is the only submachine gun Japan ever manufactured, produced in small numbers late in the war, with a bayonet lug under the barrel, because Japanese doctrine could not conceive of an infantry weapon that would not sooner or later be used to charge. Marines took them on Okinawa and on the home islands during the occupation, and almost none reached the United States in a condition or a year that allowed registration. The result is a weapon common in photographs and effectively absent from the American market. And here the list states its coldest fact plainly. A family that finds a live Type 100 under the attic insulation has found a federal felony, an unregistered machine gun that no capture story and no faded paperwork can make legal. The legal ones, the registered and transferable ones, are counted in dozens, not hundreds, dozens. That scarcity is the market. $30,000 to $40,000 for a transferable Type 100, and the number of them that can ever exist was fixed decades ago and will not grow. Number 5, the MG08/15, the gun that made the Western Front what it was, a German Maxim, water-cooled, cut down from its sled mount into something one man could theoretically carry, though with the jacket full of water it weighed more than 40 pounds, and theoretically was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. American units captured them by the hundreds in the last 100 days of the First World War, and the regiments shipped them home not as personal souvenirs but as trophies of the unit, crated to state armories and American Legion posts, where they stood on stages behind speakers every armistice day. Then the posts aged, and the armories consolidated, and over the decades some of those guns were quietly sold to collectors. Here, the rule that governs this whole list begins to pay in full. An 08/15 fires more than once per trigger pull. It exists legally only on the Federal Registry. And because the trophy guns of 1919 predate every federal machine gun law ever written, a small number pass through the amnesty windows onto that registry, and no others ever will. On the registry, one brings roughly $30,000 to $50,000. The same gun without the paper is contraband. Number 4, the Chinese Type 56 AK-47. This is the rifle standing upright in the felt of the drilled safe, the one with the Chinese characters stamped into the receiver and the yellowed form taped to the stock. A milled receiver Chinese copy of the AK-47, folding blade bayonet under the barrel, shipped by the hundreds of thousands to North Vietnam, and carried against Americans for a decade. A soldier who wanted to bring one home had a path so narrow it barely existed. Capture documentation signed in country, and then the amnesty registration period of 1968. The last time in American history a citizen could register an unregistered machine gun without penalty. A Marine filled out that form, taped it where it could never be separated from the rifle, and said nothing about it for the rest of his life. The rifle went into a safe or a closet with the paper folded beside it, waiting for a family that would not understand what the paper meant. A registered, transferable Type 56 sits between $30,000 and $50,000, and one documented bringback, tied to a named veteran and a named battle, has brought $56,000. The daughter in the kitchen inherited both halves of that arithmetic, the rifle and the handwriting that makes it legal. Number 3, the VG-1-5 Volkssturmgewehr. From the most common assault rifle on Earth to one of the rarest and the strangest firearm the Third Reich ever finished. In the last months of the war, Gustloff Werke in Suhl built a rifle for the Volkssturm chambered in the short 8mm assault cartridge, and to save machining they gave it no locked breech at all. The action is held shut by nothing but trapped gas, bled from the barrel into a sleeve around it, a mechanism almost nobody has used before or since. Production ran to a few thousand at most before Suhl fell in April of 1945, and the Americans who took the town carried a handful out with the rest of the depot souvenirs. A crude, heavy, unfinished-looking thing dropped into a footlocker beside daggers and flags that seemed far more valuable at the time. For years, the rifle fooled everyone who handled it, soldiers and families and estate sale tables alike, because it looks like something built in a shed. The number known to survive worldwide is counted in dozens. Some estimates put the figure in collectors' hands at around 20. One worn example, missing its accessories, has crossed $50,000 at sale, and a complete VG-1-5 is a price-on-request object that never reaches an open listing. The value is the count, 20 perhaps, on Earth. Number 2, the factory-engraved Krieghoff Luger. Back at number 13, the Krieghoff was an ordinary contract pistol. 13,800 of them built in Suhl for the Luftwaffe, worth a few $1,000s for the anchor on the toggle. Now put the same pistol in the hands of the factory's own engravers. Full coverage scroll work cut into the frame and receiver. Gold and precious metal laid into the steel. Presentation fittings, because these were made not for issue, but to be given. The number believed to have been engraved at the Krieghoff factory across the entire history of the contract is about 10, which makes it rarer than most guns that carry a famous name. 2 of them came home in officers' baggage, packed among the ordinary souvenirs, and in both families the engraving was mistaken for plating, and the pistol filed away in memory as Grandpa's fancy German gun. Nothing about the mechanism changed. The barrel, the toggle, the trigger, identical to the pistol at number 13, the one worth a few thousand. An authenticated factory-engraved Krieghoff is valued comfortably above $100,000, and every dollar of the difference lives in the markings, not the machine. The gun did not change. What was cut into its surface did. Number 1, the gold-washed Walther PP of Adolf Hitler. Not a service pistol, and not a battlefield capture. A presentation piece, gold-washed and finely finished, given to Hitler by the Walther family for his 50th birthday, the 20th of April, 1939. On the 29th of April, 1945, a United States Army lieutenant named Ira Palm entered Hitler's Munich apartment. He had not come for souvenirs. His mission was to capture the man himself. The apartment was empty. The man was in a bunker in Berlin with a day and a half to live. Palm left with the pistol, and it came home to America the way every other trophy on this list came home, in an officer's baggage without ceremony. And it sat in private hands for 4 decades before anyone outside the family understood what it was. When it last sold publicly, in 1987, it brought $114,000, at that time the highest price ever paid for any piece of military memorabilia, and specialists who follow this marketplace a comparable documented piece now in the high 6 figures. The buyer was anonymous. The pistol has not been seen since. Somewhere it sits in a drawer, or a vault, or a safe with a combination one person knows, which is to say it has returned to the exact condition in which this list found everything, which brings the count back to the hallway, and the safe with a hole drilled through its lock, and the daughter holding a piece of paper her father filled out in 1968 and never mentioned once in all the years he had left. Across 25 guns, the distance between $400 and $400,000 was never the steel. It was the chrysanthemum left intact instead of ground off. It was the anchor stamped on a Luger toggle. It was the federal form folded beside the rifle, and the amnesty window that opened in 1968 closed and has never reopened. The men who understood those distinctions are effectively gone now, and the objects are passing all at once to a generation that cannot read a single marking on them. For every gun counted here, thousands more are still standing in closets behind the winter coats, lying under attic insulation, waiting in safes nobody has the combination to, from the surrender fields of Cuba to the airfields of Vietnam. The rifle from the safe stands on a kitchen table now in daylight, for the first time in decades. The form taped to the stock has gone the color of weak tea, and the handwriting on it is small and careful, the handwriting of a man completing a government document he never expected to explain. It looks like nothing. It is the most valuable thing in the house. He kept the silence, and the paper kept the arithmetic, and only one of them survived him.